So before we get started, I'd just like to say thank you to Janice Wiegley, our presenter tonight, who has decided to step down from the board in the coming year. She stepped in for us when we were a man short and has been a really great part of our team. And I just want to say you will be greatly missed by us on the board.
I'm not going anywhere.
Janice is a volunteer librarian for our library upstairs and has been doing genealogy for more than 20 years. Her maternal side of the family has lived in Niagara County for many generations. Her ancestral search began with proving a family legend from being descended from Peregrine White, the first baby born in the New World on the Mayflower. She is a graduate of the University of Arizona, Herkimer College, and Alfred State College, and has plans on a certificate in genealogical studies from Boston University in the future. Welcome, Janice.
Thank you, thank you. Probably not closer to 30 years. I hate to say that, but most of my mother's family is from Niagara County. I, however, am from Erie County, but going back to probably 1820s, mostly Newfane, Heartland area. So we're going to talk a little bit about quilts today. I'm part Scottish. This is true. I have two colors. It's either transparent or crispy. I had to throw it in here for the sewers in the room. Because I used to do that to my mother with her sewing scissors when I was a child. I got yelled at a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so quilts. A quilt, technically by definition, is 3 layers. Bottom layer, the batting, the middle layer, the filler, and the top layer. It can be, they're not always piecework like these are. They can be just one plain piece of fabric. The quilting that makes it a quilt is the stitching that stitches all 3 layers together. There are some that are appliqued. An applique isn't necessarily like a piece of felt. It could be just a plain piece of fabric that's sewn on top of the other pieces of fabric. Now when I say they're not necessarily piecework like this, sewn to pieces of different colors sewn together, they can be what's called a whole cloth, and I'll show you a picture, a few slides. And it's just one solid piece of fabric. Crazy quilts, this is not necessarily a crazy quilt. It's more, the colors are more like a crazy quilt. But those are, everybody, I mean, you've probably seen crazy quilts. They are put together rather crazy. Tufting is the little pieces of yarn that you take and you put through all of the layers, and you have the two little strings that come out the top, and that's, you put the 3 layers together. That's what that is. History of quilts. Quilts have been around a really, really long time. I mean, all the way back to, Egypt. The Europe quilt history dates back mostly to the 11th century. The Crusaders would have brought it back from the Middle East and Asia. Mostly, now you wouldn't think a Crusader would be interested in quilting at all, but back then, really, they weren't bed covers, they were clothing. And they made quilted clothing, and it went under their armor to make armor more comfortable. So that kind of thing was brought back to Europe, and people started adopting it into their own clothing, and a lot of petticoats were actually quilted, and they were, warmer than just regular clothing. It was a method of also keeping warm as well. The first quilted garment is in Egypt in 3400 BC, so that's, how far back the quilt. The earliest known quilt is actually from the 14th century. It's called the Tristan and Isolde quilt, and it's from Sicily. it's the Tristan Ice. I'm sorry it's hard to see. It's a whole cloth, and it's sort of an ivory color, and it has a scene from a legend stitch on the top of it. The Colonial Era, quilts were rather rare. Bed quilts, in fact. Fabric was just uncommon. I mean, you really made your own fabric. I mean, it was all homespun. The British pretty much had a stranglehold on the fabric industry. All of the raw materials that were made in America all went to Europe, made the fabric, they printed the fabric, and they sold it back to the colonies. And the colonists literally were not allowed to print their own fabric. So fabric was, I mean, just ungodly expensive, and most people just couldn't afford it. So the quilts that actually on beds come about a generation after the Revolutionary War. And the early quilts in America are the whole cloth quilts. It's one plain, solid piece of fabric, and then they did the quilting on that. A more common, you wonder what they made on their bed? The more common is a bed rug. Bed rugs are, you think about like the latch hook kits you used to make as a kid. Bed rugs are kind of like that, but they were embroidered, and they would have like embroidered in loops, and they would have cut the loops, and it could have been, I mean, all sorts of threads. Probably mostly everything would have been made out of wool and linen at that point. This is a bed rug. Dates to 1796. Made in Connecticut. I mean, these are literally bed rugs. So these high pile, lots of fabric, lots of yarn, loved by bugs of all kinds.
Yeah.
Hence the term, snug as a bug in a rug. I couldn't really find a bug in a rug, closest I could come. This is an example of a whole cloth quilt. Same idea as the Tristan and Isolde quilt. One main color, and then they would put the stitches and make a design in the fabric. A lot of florals, stuff like that. Now, I say oldest surviving patchwork quilt in North America. Might not necessarily be true. This is the McCord Quilt. It's in Montreal. Dates back to 1726. Now, when I say that may or may not be true, there's another quilt. I don't have a picture of it. It's called the Salt and Stall Quilt, and I believe it's in New England somewhere. And they found filler. The filler inside of it was actually newspaper, and one of the newspapers dated to 1704. So originally the quilt was, oh, it's a 1704 quilt because the filler in it is dated to 1704. But lately they're kind of rethinking that may or may not be true, because technically, if you think about it, you could have had that newspaper around for 20 years before you put it in your quilt. So that one, so I didn't really include that one. 19th century quilts. This is really when the quilts started to get on beds, and they started more to be the piecework kind. It really took off after 1825, because that's about when fabric became much more affordable to the general public. Roller printing started, the wood block, where they would actually carve out the scene on a block of wood, and they would print the blocks on the fabric. So, after the Revolution, there was no more, laws against printing fabric in America, because we weren't colonies anymore, and Britain didn't have a stranglehold on that. So, it really, became much more common. The quilts sort of went with everybody when they went west. And people, you didn't really have paper or stuff like that. You really couldn't have afforded stuff like that. So a lot of the patterns were in your head. So whatever patterns you were able to remember, that's what kind of went west. Also, in the 19th century, they were used a lot for fundraising, especially around the Civil War. Ladies would get together and make a quilt and put it together for fundraising efforts, and in their town. Now, interesting fact about when I say the ladies would get together, the quilting bees really came Civil War and after. The early quilting bees were, the women would get together and they would make quilts and they would do their quilting, but the men came along as well, and it was really a party. And there was alcohol served for the men. The women didn't drink alcohol, of course, but the men did come along. And what you probably would do at this point, because quilts are made on a frame, you attach your quilt to a large square frame. And you didn't want to do this every single time you worked on your quilt. You didn't want to take that apart. So these parties and such, a lot of what people did was they would attach the quilt frame to the ceiling. And they would have the ability to bring the whole frame with the quilt on it down. And you moved the table and you moved everything that was in the middle of the room, and that's where you brought the chairs around, and that's how you would work on the quilt. And a lot of these early quilting bees, where the men came along, was really, place to, find your future husband, was what a lot happened. Commercial cotton batting starts in 1846, and this breaks my heart. The Civil War destroyed a lot of quilts. Quilts went with the soldiers. The soldiers used them and they used them up, which is true also in a lot of homes. I mean, back then, you made the quilt and you used the quilt. And the fabric was probably already had been used for something else, because you recycled all of your fabric. So a lot of the fabric that was in your quilt was most likely at one point somebody's shirt, somebody's pants, somebody's curtains, something like that, and it was reused. So they were already not in the most fabulous of condition when the quilt could have been made. So they were used and abused and used up. And in 1863, the U.S. Sanitary Commission issued 1,203 quilts to the Virginia soldiers. So they were used for bedding, and they were probably used in the hospital tents and burial shrouds and that kind of thing. And out west,
Who issued them?
U.S. Sanitary Commission. And out west, when people went out to the plains, it was kind of the same idea, but they were using them for doors and windows and protection against the elements and protection against the Indians, and that kind of thing. So as I said, the 1830s, fabric becomes more affordable. They invented the roller. It's a big copper sheet of metal that they imprint the design on it, and they're able to print a lot more fabric with designs and a lot more affordable. So it's not just like in the colonial era, if you had a quilt, you were really upper class. There was not, nobody else, the common folk did not have quilts. It was only really rich people. But at this point, the fabric became more affordable, and people were starting to find they had more time to actually make them. If you think about it, in colonial era, you spent most of your time trying to survive, food and shelter and, making it through the winter and that kind of thing. The early quilts would have really been wool and silk and linen. In the 19th century, it would have started to be more cottons. Floral was a favorite, and they did a lot of what you would call a medallion quilt, and there would be a big major something in the middle, a tree or a big basket of flowers or something in the middle with a border around it. That was a favorite back then. sewing machine. The sewing machine started to sew shoes. That was what, I mean, it wasn't for clothes at all. It's kind of confusing. There's a couple of guys involved in inventing the sewing machine. Each guy kind of did a little bit something different. Elias Howe was a big guy in inventing sewing machines. He actually had kind of a patent in 1845. Isaac Merritt Singer, though, kind of took all of everybody's sewing machine ideas of all these guys that had been doing their own thing all over Europe, and he made his own thing. And he really had the wherewithal and the entrepreneurship to kind of make something of it and sell one to everybody. So, but it kind of took a while to catch on. It wasn't until about the 1860s where pretty much most everybody had a sewing machine. Okay, early 20th centuries. This is when the published patterns started to appear, magazines and that kind of thing. So there was much more creativity and, you know, kind of traveling of patterns and such. So a lot of the old block quilts sort of disappeared. They started to invent synthetic dyes. Prior to this, it would have been all natural made, you know, walnut shells and indigo and, you know, things like that. So the colors tend to be much more brighter in 19th century quilts than you'll find in the older quilts, which is not to say that's not always a good way to date a quilt. So a lot of the old quilts have really dark, really bright colors. But when they invented the electric light, these really bright, really dark colors really kind of were really too much for people. Somebody had termed it chromophobia, and, you know, the fear of color. So that's when a lot of pastels start, is when they invented the electric light. So later on, this would be more the end of, you know, the end of the 1800s, 1900s. The Industrial Revolution is happening, and they've got all sorts of machines to make fabric and print fabric, and this is kind of a start when the quality really goes down, because they're all about the profits. And so, you know, the quality of the colors go down, the fabrics go down. I mean, it's not, you know, just any one thing. There's a whole lot that goes into that. Also, early 1900s, quilts sort of become old-fashioned. I mean, in the middle of the 1800s, quilts was the thing. I mean, that was a big, major pastime for people. But in the early 1900s, for some reason, they become sort of not real modern and not real fashionable. So the more modern comforters, one piece of fabric kind of bedding, solid white, clean lines, you know, no more, you know, quilts became much more old-fashioned. So a lot of people, it really kind of, making quilts sort of fell out of fashion at that point. And a lot of the early work includes cording. This one up here has a cord on the side of it. And like, they used to even stuff quilts. Some of the design on the top of the quilt will be much more raised, not just quilted, but they actually would take like cotton batting and stuff it in parts of these little designs, and all of that pretty much stopped. And I mean, it was a lot of work. So, you know, so people really didn't do that kind of thing anymore. Now, some of the things, dating quilts can be really difficult, and unfortunately a lot of people didn't sign their name to quilts. Some people did. Some of them did it in ink. Some of them did it in, you know, embroidered stitches, but a lot of them weren't dated. The type of stitching, the type of fabric, color, the batting, and the pattern can all hint at how old your quilt is. Now, one of the things that you can tell before I get into colors and how old a quilt is the pattern. This is a quilt my grandmother made. Now, I know all of these separate little pieces of fabric in here were probably clothing she had at one point. My grandparents were very poor. They dated for 20 years before they got married. Okay? This is an example of dating a quilt by a pattern. This is a Sunbonnet Sue pattern, and this is a 1930s quilt. Because that was when Sunbonnet Sue was very popular, was 1930s, 1940s. So that's an example of like a pattern dating.
Well, I
Yes.
don't know, should I wait till you're
No.
done? Okay.
Interrupt me, I'm good with that.
But somebody could have done a sunbonnet quilt, even though most of them were in the 30s. How do you know somebody didn't do a sunbonnet quilt outside that time period?
Because I'm putting together the fact that I know my grandmother made this and I know when my grandmother was alive.
Yeah, in your case.
So, yes,
Yeah.
yes. So that's like when I say that fabric, patterns, colors, it's sometimes, you know, I'm not dating this quilt by the color. I mean, even though it's more likely to be 20th century because there's a very baby pink on it. Pale pink is much more 20th century kind of thing. And these solid pink doesn't appear until much later. So I'm putting several clues together when I say this was 1930s and my grandmother made it.
Okay.
Yes.
So if we found that quilt, because you have the story with it, is there another way to date it that we don't know it was made in 1980? Is it just?
Like a reproduction.
Yeah, I'm just curious.
It's a big problem because the reproduction fabrics nowadays are really fabulous. But, you know, if most likely, if you're finding one, like you're getting one in an estate sale or something, you're gonna tell it's not 20, 30 years old because of the condition of it. For some reason, my grandmother never used hers. I don't know why they're in such condition. Quilts were made and used, so most of the time you're not gonna find one that's in pristine condition. So simply by the condition of it will tell you a little bit about how old it is.
So you want to try, like, if there's a way to get the story behind the quilt, you know,
Yes.
who made this quilt is an
Yes.
important question to ask. You know, do you have any guess as to when maybe that person made it? I mean,
Yes.
so the history of the person making it is probably
Yes.
real critical too. Gotcha.
Blues and purples. Blue was a very popular color even early on. It was made from indigo and it was a very color fast color. It did not fade. It washed well. It was difficult to make. And then like, I don't have an example, but you know, like bright, vibrant violets were popular between 1870 and 1900. So if you kind of have one of those colors, you can kind of, you know, say, okay, here's one thing that tells me this is, you know, the era that this quilt is from. Light blue was like pretty much from day one, so it's one of those colors that's just not useful at all whatsoever. Mid-19th century purples were pretty much a dull browny purple. Very bright, very vibrant. When I say purple to you today, like purple, bright purple, that's going to be a much more modern color. They could not, purple was a very hard color for them to do. And most always, you'll find it's not really a purple anymore. It's going to be a pink or a brown. And sometimes very old quilts can be very difficult to date sometimes because when you're looking at the color, you're thinking it's brown. It wasn't brown, it was purple. Because it's faded to that color. Those natural dyes sometimes have a tendency to do that. But the really strong, vibrant purples don't happen until after World War I. and really light purples catch on after 1925. Red, there's two very old popular reds called madder red and turkey red. Turkey red was a very color-fast dye, just like indigo was, but it was very hard to make, and it was very hard on fabrics. So a lot of turkey reds the fabrics don't survive well unless they're very well taken care of. The madder red ends up to be more of a rusty red color, and the turkey red is more of a cherry color. And orange is more likely a 20th century synthetic. Orange was just one of those colors that they didn't have way back when. Unless the pink is a solid pale pink, it's not very useful in dating. Because they could do pink. This is an example of an old pink. You can come up afterwards and look at this. This is called a double pink because it's got several shades of pink in it. But that'll tell you 1875 to 1890. But not a guarantee, because my ancestor who made this could have had the fabric around for 30 years before she made it. You know? Because everybody who either sews or quilts got a stash, right? I don't want to hear anybody saying I don't have a stash of fabric at my house, right? Yeah, you all got a basket somewhere. I know you do. My mother's was huge. Okay, green. Green was really difficult. It was another one of those hard colors. The old natural dyes, there was no green. No straight, you take some walnut shells and you're going to get brown. You couldn't do straight green. You had to put yellow and then blue together. It's called overprinting, common in 1860s. And sometimes if you get lucky with that overprinted green, you can see at some of the, in very small areas, if the overlay wasn't perfect, you'll see either a yellow or blue on that green fabric around some of the edges. Because it was really hard, because you're doing one color and then you're doing another color, so it's hard to get, the two colors together. And this is also true with old prints of like flowers and people and that sort of thing. When they were doing the rollers and things way back, it wasn't easy to get everything to line up perfectly. So one way for like very old prints will sometimes have very heavy black outlines around everything. And that's how they sort of filled in all the mistakes around some of those. Like a lot of the synthetic dyes, the early synthetic dyes don't age well, and they all really kind of faded to brown, and those are late 19th century green colors. So, and that's why I say that a color on a quilt doesn't always make it that easy, because that weird brown could be, a synthetic green, or it could be an old lavender. So sometimes you gotta take you gotta take a lot of things and put it together. Like you have, if it's, you think maybe it's a really old color, it's a brown, but it was obviously done on a machine. It's after 1850, 1860.
Is it possible to do chemical analyses to find out what the...
Yeah, but I'm not taking my quilt apart to do that.
I see. Well, if you really wanted to know where it came from, you
Yes.
could take a little
Yes.
piece of it apart.
Yes. I mean, if you wanted to maybe take it apart and get underneath it and take part of the selvage off and maybe send it away for analysis, you probably could do that.
I wonder if they do that up at Buffalo State has the conservation program. I know they have a whole conservation area for fabrics.
Yes.
That could probably help out with that.
Carol?
What are the other ways besides color and like fabric style that you could date a quilt?
Stitching, whether it was hand stitched or machine stitched. And that's not, the machine stitching gives it away to, it's after about 1860. A lot of people, earlier than that, really a lot of people didn't have sewing machines. So after 1860, but the pattern of the quilt, some are, some of the patterns didn't come out until much later. So it's sometimes you kind of got to put, the pattern together with the color, with whether it was hand done or machine done, and, can I guess who made it in the family, which we'll do a case study at the end. Black pre-1860 isn't really common unless it comes along with turkey red. White was so common it wasn't useful at all whatsoever. The more colors a quilt has, pre-1875, post-1925. Tangerine, melon, and peach seem to be good 1925 to 1950 clues. And there are a few browns after 1900 that didn't seem to be a very popular color at that point. Okay, caring for your antique quilt. Washing just isn't recommended. If you have an antique quilt, a lot of the times you're not going to know how well that fabric is. Is it, it could look good and it's not, and you wash it and it's going to be, you're just going to destroy it. So there are techniques to wash antique quilts, that's a lot of, lay it in the tub and put the water on it and soak it, and I mean it's a whole huge process, but I gotta say, just don't wash it.
When you say antique quilt, what range do you mean? 50 years ago, 75 years ago?
I would be hesitant to wash any quilt that I didn't know the fabric, where it came from, how it was made, even if it was less than 50 years old. Because if it's more modern, your chances of it coming out right in the end are better. But if it's really a quilt you want to keep and you want to preserve, washing is just not a good idea. I was horrified to find that, I knew we had these quilts at home, and I was horrified to find that my mother had actually stored them in plastic bags. It's not a place to put them. If you really need to store it in something, make it cloth, like a pillowcase, or wrap it in a sheet. If you really need to put it away somewhere folded, make sure you take it out every so often and refold it, because the folds are really hard on the fabric and they have a tendency to cause stress points in the fabric, and that's where your quilts will start coming apart, is where you folded it. One thing you can do when you fold it is to buy acid-free tissue paper, and you kind of crinkle it up and you put it inside the fold where you're folding it when you put it away. And you can get acid-free tissue paper and acid-free boxes to put the quilts in from an archival storage company. Sunlight is obviously one of the worst things you can do to a quilt, because it's going to fade, so keep it out of the sun. One thing you can do is to display a quilt is by hanging it. It's a little more stress on the quilt because you have to somehow hang it on something. So it's sometimes they'll either wrap the quilt, hang it over something, like a bar or something, and hang it on the wall, or you can attach strips of muslin to one side of the quilt and put the bar through the muslin. It's not as ideal, but if you really want to hang it and enjoy it, that's one thing you can do. Really the best place is kind of on a bed in a room that's not used, like if you have a spare room and there's no sunlight, that's literally the best place to put it. If you have somewhere that is away from any sunlight, maybe on the back of a chair or the back of a couch, that's also a good place. Air circulation is very important. But I gotta say, if you have pets at home, the on top of anything is really not a good idea, because I can tell you one of these, my cat's, it would have been scratch and post central. She would have just loved the fabric on it. It would have been a nightmare. Okay, so this quilt, this is kind of my case study. This quilt, my mother told me, I have no idea where it came from. Okay? She said it was always around. I don't remember ever anybody making it. So when I was trying to date this, I sort of scratched off my grandmother's. My mother's mother's, you know, her grandparents, because she would have known who had, if one of them had done it, she would have done it. Okay, so I think I went by one of these slides. Okay, so on the right, I'm sorry, they're really bad picture. On the right is a picture of the quilt. On the left is a picture from a book that I got. Now the book dates this green fabric. It's not exactly like the book, but it's very similar in shade and design, and it dates it to 1850 to 1870. Okay? The next clue I had was this article. This is from a Lockport newspaper in the 1930s. Mrs. E.M. Dutton of Newfane depicted the neatness of work among the well-preserved collection. A tucked spread made in 1861, the beautiful democratic rose appliqued upon white linen. The blossom block red with red buds and done in 1860 by Catherine Phillips, mother of Frank Phillips. Frank Phillips was my great-grandfather. This article is in relation to a quilt show they had at the Van Horn Mansion in the 1930s. Now the first part of it, the democratic rose appliqued upon white linen, I think is the Mrs. E.M. Dutton that's mentioned in the article, and I think the second half was mine. Now, is it this quilt? It kind of matches, it kind of doesn't match, because it's very red on the back. So, you know, but it's one clue that says my third great grandmother made quilts, okay? That's my grandmother. Now, like I said, my grandmother was poor. My mother talks about having a wood-burning stove and an ice box until she was in high school. So, my grandmother would have never bought fabric for a quilt. The fabric in this quilt was most likely purchased to make a quilt. These were not, you would not have had most likely scraps around enough like this to make this kind of a quilt. So I know it wasn't Grandma. Here's Ada. Ada was Mildred's mother. I think she would have been, and this is another, I'm taking what I think to be the age of the fabrics and the fact that this was hand sewn, along with her age. I think Ada's too young to have made this quilt. By the time she got to be old enough, I did have an appraiser look at this, and all she could tell me was late 19th century, but it was done by an expert. In order to get all of these pieces together, and if you look closely, the colors alternate from one block to another. So to get all of this to work together, it had to have been done by somebody who had been quilting a long time and somebody who was an expert. So I don't think it was Ada. And I also don't think it was her, because I spoke with one of my mother's cousins, God bless her, she's 90-something, and she said, Grandma Ada never sewed anything. I never heard her sew anything. I never saw her sew anything. All she did was knit. So I don't think it was Ada. Here's Mary. Mary was my grandfather's mother. I don't know a lot about her. She could have been old enough to have done this. I don't think she would have been quite old enough, though, to have been expert level at 30 or 40 to have done this. But it's possible. But I don't think she had enough money. 1880, 1890, the estate for the Shaft family was only about $3,000. So I don't think, well, it could have been her. My guess is probably not, only because I don't think they had the money for it. Here's Philena. Philena was Ada's mother. I apologize for the picture on the right. That's their house. But the picture actually does look like that color. That house is still standing. It's on the Hess Road, and it's bright red right now. Philena is one of the big possibilities to make this. Because she would have been about the right age. And by the looks of their house, I'm sure they had enough money That picture dates from between 1890 and 1901, because the husband that's in the picture sitting down died in 1901. So that was shortly before that. So it could have been her. Here's my grandfather's mother, Saber Farley Phillips. If you've ever been to Newfane and gone past Cook's Bed and Breakfast, that house was Saber's house. Saber didn't sew. Everybody in the family tells me Saber was not a sewer. So, and she's too recent. She's not old enough to have made this. And her mother, I don't think had the money, and I don't think she would have done this. Just too obscure, not enough, just not, absolutely not enough money. This is Catherine Phillips. Catherine Phillips would have been the mother of Sabra's husband, Frank. Frank is the one that was just mentioned in that article with the quilt from 1860. Her husband, David Phillips, who's in the picture on the right, I believe that to be him. His father was Abraham Phillips, and anybody who's familiar with Newfane and knows of Phillips Road, the Phillips Road was named after David's father, Abraham. Abraham was very rich. He owned almost 500 acres upon his death in 1866. They were a very rich family. Where did all the money go? I don't know. It certainly didn't trickle down to me. But she died in 1881. And I know she quilted, because it mentioned that in the article from the quilt show that she did quilt, and her son Frank did have one of her quilts. Is this the quilt? I don't know, I can't guarantee it. But my guess is that this quilt was made by Catherine Phillips. 1860s, 1870s. And that's kind of my case study for quilts. Any questions?
Well. So she obviously didn't, she just made it, didn't use it. I was
You know what?
struck by the
I have
condition
no
of it.
idea why
Looks so wonderful.
it wasn't used. It's in absolutely pristine condition, and the
Yeah.
appraiser was like, oh my God, when she saw it. So I don't know why nobody used it.
Yeah.
And, it was one of those things where, why did my grandfather end up with it? Because he hated his family. So why he kept the family quilt, I don't know. My grandfather's first name was David, named after David. He never used the name, he hated it. Everybody called him Tink. So, but Catherine Phillips is my best choice, and will I ever know? No. But
So there's no.
there's really no guarantee.
Did they sign?
Some of them did, but most of them didn't.
Yeah, okay.
Especially 19th century quilts weren't signed.
Uh-huh.
A lot of the older quilts, if they exist, 18th century quilts, that kind of thing, early quilts, were more likely to be signed because your embroidery was part of your identity
Yeah.
when you were a woman. So,
Yeah.
but, and it's, you want to preserve them. It's sort of something you have to decide, do I want to preserve this? Do I want to pass this down to my kids? Do I want to enjoy it? What do I do with it, when you have one? And as much as I would say they're great to pass down and they're great to give to your children and your grandkids, they may not want it. So, and you know what, if you love it and want to use it, I think, go for it. And if it doesn't survive to being passed on, then, if that's what you want to do and use it and love it, I think that should be done. But if you want to preserve it and pass them on, you can do that. That's about it. That's all I have. Thank you very much.
Beautiful.
If anybody wants to go up and look at the quilts,
Just keep the food
just
away
keep
from
the
them.
fingers away, the food away.
There's a lot more